right?
We do have a
There
quorum.
we go.
And
Okay.
I think Peter Kindle is going to be presenting. So if you can promote him to have presentation abilities, that'd be great too.
I do.
Good, thank you.
All right, CC, I think we're ready to go. And Alan, we've got a quorum, so we'll call the meeting of the Point of the Mountain State Land Authority to order and get started with the agenda. Hope, trust all of you have had a good holiday. We haven't met since Christmas and New Year's, and a lot has happened, hasn't it? So without commenting further on that, let's jump into the agenda. Welcome all of the board members again back, and also special welcome to some new appointees. I don't know yet whether they've joined us or whether they will, but Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson has been appointed to take the position of Lieutenant Governor Cox, who of course is now Governor Cox. She was appointed by Governor Cox, and I think she was with us in our last meeting. So she's also been appointed as co-chair. So we look forward to working with her, and I think all of you, or most of you know Lieutenant Governor Henderson, formerly Senator Henderson. Also, as you all know, Val Hell has retired, and with that came a vacancy on the board. That's being filled by the new Director of the Governor's Office of Economic Development, Dan Hemmert, who was formerly Senator Hemmert. And I don't know whether Dan is with us yet or not either, but we welcome both of them to the board, and they're going to be great additions and make significant contributions to our work. Going on to the next item. Oh, before we do that, I have the privilege every meeting of reading this document that's apparently required by law that allows us to conduct meeting by virtual means, and I'm required to read it. So this is the Point of the Mountain Land Authority Board meeting determination. I, Lowry Snow, co-chairman of the Point of the Mountain Land Authority Board, have determined that the January 12, 2021 meeting of the board will be held electronically without an anchor location. This determination is based on the following facts. One, Utah is currently dealing with COVID-19, which has been determined to be a pandemic. COVID-19 is extremely contagious and can be deadly to those who contract it, especially those of advanced age and underlying health conditions. Number two, the agency offices in Salt Lake County are currently in the state's high-risk category. This limits the size of public gatherings to individuals within your own household and requires the wearing of masks and social distancing in public places. People are encouraged to stay in their homes. Number three, a vast majority of agency staff and the members of the board are teleworking to avoid unnecessary contact with others. Number four, the boardroom is insufficient to allow social distancing and reasonably safe accommodations of the board and the public. Number five, the board uses an electronic platform which allows interested parties to view the meeting, hear discussions, and provide written comment. That is dated the 6th of January, 2021 over my signature as co-chair. So we'll finishing that formality. We'll go on to the next item of the agenda, which is to approve minutes of meetings held December 8th and December 17th. Those have been sent to you before this meeting to review by CC. And by the way, CC, when I went over the minutes, great job. You do such an excellent job of recording all of the business and action of our meeting. So with that, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of both meetings. If you'd care to make that motion, someone care to make that motion, combining both those minutes in one motion.
This
Mr.
is
Chair.
Mayor. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I move that we approve those with one very, very slight adjustment. The meetings from December 17th have the members in attendance listed, and my name isn't listed. I was a few minutes late to the meeting because I was coming from another one, but my name isn't on there as attending, and I did. So anyway, I would just love to have that added to it, and otherwise I move that we approve the minutes as they stand.
All right,
Second,
and
by
that-
Troy Walker.
Excuse me, was there a second?
By Troy Walker, yes.
By
Mr. Chair.
Mayor Walker. So the motion is that we approve the minutes of December 8th, 2020 and December 17th, 2020 with the addition of including Mayor Ramsey as being in attendance. Is that your motion, Mayor?
Correct. Thank you.
All in favor of that motion, say aye.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries and the minutes of both meetings are approved. Thank you very much. So item 3, excuse me, actually I skipped item 2, moving too quickly. Item 2 is on our agenda to receive public comment. The public is welcome to share comments with the board using the procedures set forth at the bottom of the agenda, and that procedure was adopted by the board some time ago. Since this isn't a meeting where I can see folks, if there is someone from the public that has joined us and would like to comment, please speak up. Not hearing any comments, no one coming forward. We'll move on to the next item of the agenda. Number 4 is the POMSLA UDOT UTA agreement to transfer funds. Just a little bit of background. We worked with UDOT and UTA to have analyzed an alternative route for transit to the Point of the Mountain site in anticipation of development. In order to accomplish that, it takes funding. Last session, we were able to get part of that, a portion of that, the preliminary work that needs to be done. The appropriations came to, I believe, to our body. But in any event, I'm going to turn the time to Alan, and he can explain if I'm right about that appropriations and how we need to transfer it to a different agency.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and you are correct. So in House Bill 3, which was passed in the 2020 general session, it included an appropriation moving money from the Transit Transportation Investment Fund to GOED, to us, to then go to the Department of Transportation for the purposes of conducting a study of a preferred alternative for transit at Point of the Mountain. And I think the unstated intent was that that money eventually would go to to UTA to continue or at least start that study. So we wanted to make sure that all of those steps were documented, that we met the requirements of law, and that there was accountability on the part of UTA that when they do the work that they send in reports indicating how they've used that money. So with JC's great help and in coordination with UDOT and UTA, we've developed the agreement that was attached to your agenda. It's pretty straightforward, but I think everybody agrees that it addresses the needs that we have for accountability, complying with law, and making sure that that money makes it through all of those steps and gets to the right place. So would recommend your approval of an agreement substantially similar to what you've seen in the board packet.
So thank you, Alan, for that explanation. This, as Alan says, is some preliminary funding, but it's important and necessary in order for us to, and really in order for the development of the site as we anticipate looking at this route. So with that, I would entertain a motion to approve this what do you call it, Alan? This,
I think it's a memorandum of agreement that we put together.
this MOU, or this memorandum of agreement that allows us to transfer funds to accomplish that purpose.
So moved.
Here,
So moved.
And
Mayor
and who
Walker.
made that? Okay, Steve Handy, Representative Handy, your motion is to approve that transfer. And if you would add as a friendly part, subject to, you have a copy of a proposed document subject to making some modifications and allowing the director to work with legal counsel in order to adjust it to meet the intention of your motion. Is that agreeable? You're on mute, but I'm pretty sure I'm reading your lips and you said okay. So you're still on mute, Steve. CC, can you unmute Representative Handy?
Am I back?
You're back now.
Yes, agreeable with your clarification, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And do we have a second, please?
second,
Was that Mayor Walker?
it was, yes, yes.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Steve. Discussion on the motion from any of the board members? Not hearing any, we'll place the motion for a vote. All in favor of that motion for this action, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Rule that the motion carries unanimously. Thank you for that. So the next item on the agenda is the issue of reaching a contract and approving a contract with SOM. Board members, you will recall that in our last meeting on December 17th, we selected SOM as our planning team to create a framework master plan for the point. That motion was contingent on our director and legal counsel, JC, to help negotiate a contract with SOM. And that has been accomplished. And you have received a copy of that document in your packet before today's meeting. You will recall that this this comes as a culmination of a very long process, a selection process, as you all know. Some of you participated in that. We'll recognize the SOM team, the next item on the agenda, but I know that they're here at least on the virtual screen with us. We appreciate very much you being in attendance today, but also your participation in that process. I, for one, and maybe I speak for others on the board, are very excited and anxious to have you introduce yourselves and your project. And we see the work that you're going to be doing as the next major significant step in the development of this project. So before we get to that, though, and getting back to the issue at hand, which is to approve your contract, I'm going to turn some time to Alan and let him provide some more background, if that's okay, Alan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be quick here. As you directed, we entered into some conversations with the SOM team to get in place a contract for their engagement and to clarify the details of the scope of work. So the contract that we've completed has three parts to it. One is the basic contract language, and we've taken the DFCM standard contract and just modified it as necessary so that it identifies Point of the Mountain State Land Authority as the party rather than DFCM. So again, that's kind of the standard agreement. The second part is attachment A that includes the scope of work. And we sent that to all of you. You can see that it's quite detailed. And we have had a number of discussions with SOM to put that in place. And the third piece is an attachment B, which is just the documents that comprise the proposal that SOM made during our selection process. And that document, or the series of documents, was well over 200 pages, so we spared you that detail. But let me just say, SOM has been great to work with. They've been responsive. They have been thoughtful in putting together a scope of work and a plan for moving forward in a constructive way. So we really appreciate that. And we would ask that you approve this contract substantially as the one you received. I say substantially just in case there's a little non-substantive tinkering that needs to go on. But that's our recommendation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Alan. Are there any questions for Alan from the board? Alan, the figure under a payment, that figure is consistent with the proposal that we approved. Isn't that correct? The maximum figure?
It is. That's correct. And I do need to recognize JC Skinner, who always has been tremendous, and she spent time going through this document and making sure that we were heading in the right direction. So thanks, JC.
Thanks, JC, for your help. So it's nice that our legal counsel has also been through it and is prepared to approve it as to form. Any other questions from board members? Okay, if there are no questions, I would entertain a motion to approve the form of the agreement that you have in your packet, subject to any technical modifications that need to be made, but nothing substantive. That would be a motion.
This is Phil Moore, so moved.
Thank you, Senator Fillmore, for your motion to approve the contract subject to technical changes. Do I have a second of that motion?
Second.
Was that Jim?
Commissioner Wilson and Hume got it, so.
Okay, David, thank you for the second. Any further discussion to the motion? We'll place it for vote then. All in favor of the motion that we approve the contract is written, and with that approval, give authority for the board essentially to enter into that contract with SOM, subject to technical changes. All in favor of that motion, say aye.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you for your good work, Alan, negotiating, and JC for your legal expertise in reviewing and the contract. So with that, we'll move to item number 6 on the agenda, which is to introduce our planning team. Let me just say, I've said something earlier about how excited we are. I think everyone is anticipating this meeting. This has been a really long process to get to this point, but it's been a good process. And I haven't been involved in reviewing the proposals, but every time I've touched base with Alan after, and especially after SOM was selected, he was really positive and said great things about SOM. And I think we're all, based on his recommendations and the others that were involved in that process, looking forward to hear your presentation. So with that, Alan, if it's okay, because I think you've worked with some of these the SOM team on a personal level, would you mind if I turned the time to you to introduce them and to us, and then we'll let them go forward with their presentation.
I'd be happy to. Thanks. And I'll be quick because I think we want to hear from them. But we've got Carrie Biles and Doug Voigt, who are partners with SOM. Erin May is the project manager on this engagement. Peter Kindle, also with SOM, and Steve Sobel with SOM. And introduce as well Jim McCrae, who's with Design Workshop, part of the team. So these are outstanding folks, senior members of their organizations with a lot of good experience. And we look forward to having all of you hear what we've heard as part of the selection process.
So much, Alan and Mr. Chairman. You'll see here just a brief introduction here that we'd love to give to you all to that process that we underwent in the charrette. So I'm going to turn this over to Carrie Biles, who will introduce you to the team a little more generally, and then we'll present to you some of the outcomes of that charrette so that you can have an understanding of the basis where we're starting the work from as we enter into this great opportunity that is really something that we are so incredibly excited to be able to join.
Yeah, Pete, if you could advance the slide. I'd just like to say a little bit more about the team members that Alan just introduced. I will be the principal in charge, and I'm an architect who specialized in working with high-tech firms and on research and academic buildings, and did my first project in Salt Lake City when I worked on the University of Utah's master plan in 2008. Doug Voigt is the design partner responsible for the project and has done incredible master plans around the world. And he's going to talk a little bit about our work in a few minutes. But one thing I wanted to point out is that SOM has been around since 1936 and is pretty well known, but we're a fairly small operation in that there's only 20 partners that own SOM. And Doug and I are two of those partners, and you will have our personal attention on this project. We can be very selective about the work we take, and we only work on projects that have high aspirations for sustainability, quality, and commitment to society at large. I'm also one of the 3 partners that runs the firm on the executive committee. So should anyone have any concern about the performance of our services or ideas on how we could do better, please feel free to give me a call. Peter Kindle is the design director that will be working night and day on this project for you, no doubt, and working very closely with Doug, and is a wonderful professional and has brought a lot of the art and quality to the work that has been done to date. Erin May is our project manager, and he's our single point of contact, and he's very capable. We're going to have quite a number of consultants working for us on this project. You never have to figure out who to call. Just call Erin, and he'll make sure that the right person responds to your needs. And during the whole pursuit process, which has been a number of months, we've been working with Jim McCrae and his team, and I really have found them delightful collaborators, and think the work that they have done during this process is really beautiful, and I think you'll enjoy seeing it here in a few minutes. And then last but not least, Steve Sobel. He started working in Utah in 2008 with the cultural master plan for downtown Salt Lake City, and has been very hands-on here, working on projects from 111 South Main, 222 South Main, Harmons. He's now working on 95 State Street. Very dedicated to the region, as we all are, and very excited about the project. So Pete, if you'd like to advance the slide. One mission statement that we're very dedicated to and we share with you is that we're this collective of planners and designers and engineers committed to building a better future, and our highest aspiration is to address the effects of climate change and everything that entails. So we were have always been very excited about this region's very pragmatic approach to really driving down energy and water use and doing things that are will be models for the future. And we do this with a multidisciplinary firm. We're focusing on planning, but because we have all these other disciplines within the firm, we always look at everything holistically to make sure everything we do as planners can be exceptionally executed further down the line. And we hope that this is a long-term partnership with you. And before I hand off, I do want to say just how incredibly excited we are about this project for a number of reasons. But the two most important reasons were that we were really impressed with the quality that your team has done and putting together the basis of design materials and organizing the selection process, and the time we spent with them during the workshops. The design opportunity here is exceptional, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But a design opportunity alone doesn't mean that something that will happen is something that will happen and happen well. And it was the quality of your stakeholder groups, the quality of the minutes and the reports that came out of those groups, the quality of the community outreach, and the quality of the team that worked with us, from Alan to Jim, Steve, Aaron, Muriel. Everyone was so great to work with that we are absolutely confident that this is going to be a wonderful success. And the opportunity is unique. And that is, at this moment in time when the world has just gone through such a dramatic change, pandemic aside, there's been an acceleration in the adoption of technology over the last year that set the world in motion in a way that's very different, and I think could lead to much greater work-life balance and a greater quality of life for all that come to the point. And to be able to work with you on this project at this moment in time is something that we just could not be more excited about. And we look forward to this collaboration. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our team to present to you some of the materials that we developed with your team over the last 3 months.
Thanks, Carrie. I think, the firm's always been focused on cities, the civicness of projects and how they contribute to human well-being. And, this approach that we'll walk you through today is sort of rooted in how we've taken a holistic understanding of cities so that every project contributes to the vitality of that place, like our work at Millennium Park over many, many years. Next, Pete. We've also been involved in the planning and design of many strategic and coordinated investments that have extended positive impact within their own communities, like Denver Union Station, not far from you. Next. But we also are very much passionate about the relationships we form. And for example, at the University of California, Merced, it's been an over 20-year relationship where we focused on advancing new ideas around health and well-being, but also as the first public research university in the country to reach carbon neutrality, we also understand what's required to meet these aspirations. Next. One of the things that became quite apparent to us is the competitiveness for talent, and that what the point offers really speaks to how do you create these environments that spur innovation, both at the scale of a building, like this innovation partnership building with the University of Connecticut, to then the next slide, Pete, where we're able to pioneer the future of the campus or the future setting that really creates ways to enable and attract not only emerging talent, but also the investment to sustain those over the long term, like Cornell Tech in Roosevelt Island outside New York City. And so just that as background, there's been so much work done to date. We clearly saw that as a beginning point to advance what really resonated to us around sustainability, creating a destination, but also understanding the local impact of uniqueness in the series of neighborhoods within Salt Lake County and the larger region and the benefits that those provide. We understand the importance of this project, not just the 700 acres, but sort of the regional importance this has for the economy as well as the surrounding community. Next slide. But also the ability to capture the full potential put forward in the authority's goals. And how do we translate that into some very inspiring and innovative ideas about designing the future community? Next. And in doing so, synthesize the ideas that have been put forward by the community through all of the workshops and interface that has been done in a way that is creative, that adds value, but also advances the community's values within this planning initiative. Next. So to get to the big idea, one of the things we saw was an opportunity to really create maybe the first 15-minute city. And by that, we mean something that's incredibly walkable, incredibly connected, diverse, inclusive, but also that everything is within a short walk. And this would be a change in thinking what you see in many cities and developments around the country. Next. So we'd like to walk you through the journey we had with the selection committee and a process of identifying principles to translate those ideas into some potential ways to organize the site. And this idea of connections, the ecological connections of river to ridge was very inspiring for us as sort of a central element. Pete, if you go to the next slide, you can begin to see how this would influence the character and scale of every neighborhood, so that wouldn't it be great if everyone was within a walk outside their door to a trail? Wouldn't that be fabulous? Next slide. But also that we utilize what nature is providing in terms of a natural ecology and series of systems that can help guide the development, so that the plan is really driven by environmental and ecologically based ideas, such as stormwater, but also thermal or human comfort between buildings. Doing so in a way that starts to balance development and nature in very innovative ways. Next slide. Clearly, access and mobility are key. So we started to look at ways to not only mitigate and distribute traffic, but to make it easily accessible, not just by car, but by transit, bike, and well-scaled blocks that encourage walkability. Next slide, Pete. And this street network can unlock new opportunities to not only help locate future business and industry partners, but also provide walkable and short connections to surrounding residential areas. Next. We talked a lot about how do you create a central focus or identity. For us, that means not only buildings, but also the civic spaces that they frame. And this idea of a 15-minute city, when you see it overlaid on the site, suggests we could have an opportunity right in the geographic heart of this plan. If you go to the next slide, Pete, what's so compelling about this as an idea is it creates many opportunities to reflect community values. What's great about Utah and living here in this part of the country, outdoor concerts and endless opportunities within the public domain, but that we connect those to other more neighborhood centered, perhaps even smaller scale, more unique and diverse series of centers, as you see in this diagram. And again, just if you go to the next slide, Pete, an early illustration of understanding these just aren't places that should be active 9 to 5. They could be places that bring people out at night, but are also active within the weekends. Next. At 700 acres, scale is an incredible asset to create this new model and sustainability and how we look at the connectivity of all of the systems, both natural and man-made, regenerative approach to how we design our cities. And it begins with, on the next slide, Pete, this diagram of walkability, expanding housing choices for everyone, all done in a very sustainable and forward-thinking way. Next. And the seventh principle speaks to looking at how this project connects beyond just the site itself to the other destinations within this part of the county, but also those not on this map. And understand this is part of a broader network of places and attractions, and how we complement what's already there and what already makes this region so attractive for residents and businesses. Next. And so that may be sort of ways to blend new and more traditional character within the neighborhoods. If you go to the next, it clearly requires an attention to the design of the public realm, these very mixed, inclusive, and animated spaces. And if you go to the next, that as we think about density, it's not a one size fits all, but it's a range across the site so that there's something here for everyone. Next slide, Pete. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Kindle. As Carrie mentioned, I'll be one of the design leaders on this, on the project. And I just want to reiterate how thrilled we are to participate. Jim McCrae and I would like to just walk you through some of the very early ideas that we developed. As you may know, we did go through about a 5-week charrette process, a workshop process with the selection committee. And Jim, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. And one of our focuses was really on the regional connectivity.
Thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, everyone. So we, as Doug mentioned, one of the primary goals is establishing regional destinations. The project has an opportunity to really leverage what already exists, the trails that exist along the river or the Porter Rockwell. So we've provided an idea to really create an interlink between those two to enable people who will live and work at the point to access all the wonderful regional open space and recreation, but conversely, to enable people who live in Draper and the outlying cities to visit the point and to take advantage of everything that we're going to offer to them in terms of parks and open spaces. Next. That's 50, but I'm assuming that the next slide is the image of the Natural History Museum of Utah. Oh, sorry. Which is effectively a project we designed to be a destination along the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, like we see with the point. We also know, as Doug mentioned early on, the importance of ecological connectivity, that being from the river to the ridge. And so we've designed a system, a really effective ecological corridors throughout the property. But we need to add to that, there's another strategy, which is to establish what we call bio-islands, which are these little dots that you see in the plan that are effectively ecological stepping stones, allowing for birds and pollinators and such to migrate through the project to connect to other existing habitats that are outlying the project. Next slide. A bit of a delay here. I assume the next slide is the image of people in a botanical garden. We designed a botanical garden, not just for the benefit of plants and education, but also to incorporate art. We know that parks and open space serve fundamentally for ecological and recreational benefit, but I think they really should serve more than that. They should build community. They should have a civic and cultural aspect, as we were able to incorporate in this botanical garden we did near Albuquerque. Next slide. Sorry, there's definitely a delay here, so I'm not seeing the image yet.
Thanks.
Just so you know, it's moving along for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're seeing progress.
It's not moving for me. So.
Yeah,
Jim,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So with that ecological framework, we explored actually 6 options with the selection committee. And this is something that we'll also be doing during the framework plan process over the next 5 months. We'll be exploring different options with the team and with under your review, really to find the optimal mix of development area and open space. And this is an important part of the planning framework. We also have the ability using digital methods to analyze every option. We did this during the charrette process. This diagram shows access to transit. So we're able to measure each master plan option by its proximity to transit. We can measure GFA and economic return. We can also measure elements such as access to open space. So all of these parameters will form the framework plan process, and we can then develop quantitative information about each of the options. During the charrette process, we did arrive at a framework plan that we thought represented an approach. This is not meant to be the consensus right now. It's simply was produced for the workshop process. But this one shows about 52% developable area on the site. We think that's a extremely reasonable metric that's in line with a lot of typical development around the region, around the nation. We can increase that development ratio if you like. We can decrease it. So the plan and the framework plan process will be quite flexible. A second important idea that Doug touched on is this idea of identifiable districts within the master plan. So with 600 acres, it's a very large site, as you know. So it's important to give each portion of the master plan a distinct identity. This will help in the communication of what each district is intended to do. It will also begin to attract partners and tenants to these different districts. And with Design Workshop, we did create a green infrastructure plan. Jim, if you can see this diagram.
Yeah, so just to add to what Pete was starting to talk about, we have this opportunity to take these open space corridors and use them for production to serve different purposes, that being for the storage and cleansing of water from the runoff before we discharge it back into the South Jordan River. Next slide. As an example of that, the work that we did over at Daybreak, all the park's open spaces were designed with this idea of water conveyance and water purification, either through kind of architectural treatments, as you see in the image on the left, or in very passive natural landscapes, image to the right. All of this actually provided a beautiful sort of scenic quality, but it also provided an economic benefit in the form that we were able to reduce some of the stormwater infrastructure and impact fees quite significantly at Daybreak. Next slide. And I think, you know, landscapes are recreational oriented, but they also can be used for production. And in this day of pandemic, we're finding the need to source and grow our own food within the communities, as was done at Daybreak. And we're doing several projects like this throughout the Midwest. Just, you know, a point of creating community through growing food.
Thanks, Jim. Also through the charrette process, we developed the beginnings of a connectivity strategy. Doug mentioned this. We know this is extremely important to the board. This idea of people being able to easily access the site, move through the site in a very connected and seamless way. So this diagram is a road network diagram. This is the type of diagram we'll be developing during the framework plan process with up to about 13 points of connectivity to surrounding road networks. We also know that transit is a very important part of the project. And I think one of the things we're very excited about is access to transit. This shows a BRT route that could potentially be aligned in the manner that you see here. We want to bring transit right to the center of the site and connect both north up to Salt Lake City and then also to the communities to the south. So the idea of a fully transit connected project is extremely important to this idea of a 15-minute city, that you can take transit here, get off the BRT line and have easy access to all of the elements. This drawing shows an illustrative plan of the charrette process outcome. again, this is simply to generate some initial ideas around the beginnings of the project. We'll develop multiple iterations of this during the framework plan process, but this begins to show those districts that we talked about, the connectivity. You can also see the river to ridge trail, which runs from the lower right to the upper left. We think that's a very viable idea that can be incorporated into this larger, what we're calling the green necklace. So we're extremely excited to continue to advance these ideas into the next phase. And as you can see in this illustrative looking to the southeast towards the actual point of the mountain, you can see generally the scale of the buildings. We know this is a project that will have a density that's appropriate for the surrounding communities. And you can see that central space in the middle of the project adjacent to the green boulevard that connects through the project north to south. You can also see the river to ridge trail, which we think will work. So again, very preliminary visioning, but we think a lot of really exciting potential here. And I think at the end of the day, one of our key goals is to connect the people of Utah to this site, to return the site to its rightful place in the urbanization of the Salt Lake City Valley, but to do it in a way that really represents a 21st century sustainable approach that provides multiple modes of connectivity, new housing opportunities, and of course, jobs and economic development. Moving forward, we have begun to scope out the project schedule. We're anticipating client meetings, formal client meetings every 2 weeks, but we also wanted to acknowledge the contributions of Steve Kellenberg and Aaron on the development of the plan so far. And we anticipate staff working meetings actually in between the formal client meetings. So this is just a schematic of how we see the project playing out. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we anticipate it, this stage anyway, the framework plan stage, wrapping up sometime in early June. So thank you so much, and we'd be happy to take any questions from the board or from anyone else.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let's go to the board and see if there are questions.
This is Dawn. I don't know that I have any questions at this point. And I recognize that this is high level, but I just have to say, I love what you just showed to us. I love what you shared with us. I love the vision of this. And I realize there's a lot of fine tuning that will take place, but I really, really like what you just presented to us. And so I just want to say thank you. You know, we've been working on this for the last couple of years. And if you take a look at the site right now, it doesn't look anything like what you just showed us. And we've tried to keep an open mind and recognize that this has unlimited potential. And what you just showed us, I think, is beautiful. I absolutely loved it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Ramsey. Other comments or questions? April.
This is April. Great job. I agree with Dawn. It looks beautiful, and I think the ideas and everything in it. The only thing I'm wondering, and this might be for Alan and some others in the group, how far have we pushed ahead with like UTA and transit and some of the underlying things that we're really counting on to happen before we push through a beautiful design then that gets kiboshed by some type of roadblock? So I'm just curious. I know we're pushing really hard for them to finish this framework quickly, but is it going to get demolished by something that we're not surprised that comes up?
Would you like me to take a shot at that?
I don't know. Whomever.
I can't guarantee there won't be problems along the way, but I can tell you that we have gone through an extensive process with local communities, UDOT, UTA, the metropolitan planning organizations and have identified a preferred alternative for transit through this site. And the contract that we approved earlier will allow the next step to begin doing the environmental study and starting to get into design a little bit of that. So I think we're quite confident. There seems to be unanimity around the concept of bringing transit through the site. So I think that'll happen. The timing's actually good because as UTA starts the environmental study on their preferred alternative, we're going to be doing this master planning work, and we'll be able to work in conjunction on outline kind of the path forward, both the mode and the route of that potential transit.
Okay, and that preferred alternative has been communicated to SOM, or have we even got that far yet?
We have shared that with them. It's still conceptual, so there are a lot of details that need to be worked through. And that's why we think the timing's pretty good, because at a key planning stage for both the transit and for our site, we're going to be able to look at those concurrently.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then just a question on some old stuff. Do we have, and I don't know if this is for Lowry or Alan, I don't really know who this question's for. Do we have anyone that's like growing trees, like a nursery or something, where we have to wait a certain amount of years so that they can pull out their growth? You know, like if you buy a piece of property from, let's say, a hay farmer, but they get to get their crop that year. Do we have any issues with some long-term leases or with somebody? It seemed like right on the skirt of the property, we had a landscaper that was planting trees. Are there a certain amount of years that we have to give them to wait, or can we move forward? I just want to make sure we're appropriate with this stuff too.
Yeah. Well, Jim may have more information than I do, but I'm not aware of any constraint. There has been a rancher who's leased part of the property to raise cattle and graze cattle on the site. We've notified them that that lease is coming up at the end of the year, and so he'll be out. There is a nursery on the site that's been used by the state for a long time. Jim, you probably know more than I do, but my understanding is it's a state facility and we've got some flexibility there.
Yeah, we're moving that facility, by the way, and the tree growing for the Lone Peak Fire Facility is that program wound down. So if there's any trees there, they could probably be transplanted. The only tree that I know that's going to be a problem maybe would be the tree right there by the Lone Peak facility where the seeds went to on a space shuttle trip or whatever. And I guess there's some significance to that tree. And we do have the fire management facility, the red buildings down there on the frontage road that nobody's proposed moving them yet. They're only about 5 or 6 years old. So it would be nice to keep them to the latter part of the development, if at all possible, just to run their life out a little bit before we have to tear them down and build new buildings.
Right. So I'm not trying to be a pessimist, Alan, at all. I'm just trying to think of things that we talked about in 2018, 19, and 20, and then kind of share that information. I had recalled there was a nursery, and I just wasn't sure what the laws were, like I wasn't sure if they were in the midst of growing pine trees that are 3 years out and we can't do anything with it. So, but if all that stuff's been addressed, I just wanted to point it out. That's all.
It's a great point, and one of the first steps that we'll take with the planning team is an opportunities and constraints analysis. We've shared with them materials that have been prepared by Horrocks Engineering that did the site survey, but we've also shared a lot of information about what's going on in the broader region. So one of the first steps is to go through and make sure that we understand the opportunities and constraints at the site that we need to work around as part of the planning.
Alan, just a point of note, maybe for the board, I've spoken about the fleet and surplus and DFCM building that's on the site, that needs to be moved, as well as the DNR Lone Peak facility. Those two projects will be proposed to the IGG committee on February 3rd. Any support we can get for those two would be great.
Well, Jim, we'll make sure that we get you some support for that. That's important. So you keep Alan and I in the loop, but if necessary, we'll come and support you at that meeting.
Yeah, I'll let some times be known. They were both also recommended in the governor's recommendations as well. So
very good. April, just if I go back to your first question, this alternative route for transit is not something that just came up within the last couple of months. We've worked on this for probably 2 years, and my impression is, given the position of leadership of the legislature and the governor's office and as Alan mentions, the traffic, UDOT and the planning agencies, UTA, nothing is ever certain, but from all indications at this point, from all the planning that is being done, indicates that this is going to be an alternative route for transit. And I don't think I should even refer to it as alternative much longer, because I think that's where it's going to go. That's my impression.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions or comments for the SOM team?
I have a question, Mr. Chair, if I might pose that.
Sure, Steve.
Thank you. To Carrie and your team, a very impressive presentation. I'm a state legislator appointed to this board, and I wrote a note down. One of your team members said 21st century sustainability approach. I'm very interested in that. I wanted to ask you about the concept of smart communities, smart cities. I served a couple years ago on the National Conference of State Legislators. It was a task force looking at smart communities, smart cities. We went to Columbus, Ohio, and looked at what was going on there. They had a $40 million grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation. But I wondered, Carrie, if someone could comment about that, the integration of that concept into where your thinking is. That makes sense?
Yeah, actually, I think that Doug is probably the person that can speak most eloquently to this, but it is going to be very important. And we do plan to have various work sessions on this topic. And of course, it's making sure that we've enabled the project to adopt to the technologies as they evolve and not take on bleeding edge, not base a plan on bleeding edge technology, if ultimately that doesn't end up being the direction. But we do think it is an important component in reducing the resource use and the connectivity on site. Doug, do you want to speak to that?
No, I'd be happy to, Carrie. And what a great opportunity, because it's a blank slate. In fact, I think Pete highlighted, we're going to be using data and computation. We've already been using it so that we can test ideas around density, infrastructure, but also passive things in terms of solar, wind, the ability to create microclimates between buildings, which then reduces the load on buildings. That's just good design that we need to do at the beginning. But I think to your point, and the reference to Columbus, Indiana, really suggests we should, as part of our engagement, reach out to those industry partners that are starting to create demonstration projects that have real feedback on the success and viability of those, so we can get that integrated into the thinking, whether it's sensors and roads, lighting that's coordinated. But also as we move forward, I think looking at the systems, both at the building and the district scale, that can be optimized through a new approach to just basic heating and cooling, and how do we generate our energy. We had the ability to work with engineers in Copenhagen that were part of their plan to bring the city down to carbon zero by 2035, and I think they're well on their way. So we can apply a lot of that research to the thinking and the infrastructure that we actually put in place.
Well, that's wonderful for a top-level briefing. Thank you very much. Very, very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Doug. Carrie, other comments or questions for the SOM team? I just have a couple of comments, and they're not questions, but I hope that the board recognizes as we've gone through these slides, the one particular one that shows the comparison of different models of open space, percentages of open space. That was, I thought, really demonstrated well the challenges that Aaron has been visiting with us about having to make decisions about this project, how much we devote to open space, which is incredibly attractive and wonderful, versus how much we need to utilize to get the return on investment for our state. And those are some important considerations. But I just wanted to say to the SOM team, actually seeing that described that way helps us, I think, is going to help us meet that challenge. The other thing I liked about your presentation, there was a lot and that I liked, but the slides where you do a preliminary division into different pod concepts for commercial buildings, for residential, and I know those are tentative and just using for illustrative purposes, but those are the kinds of things now in a relatively short period of time we're going to be undertaking is how we plan and then who we partner with for those different portions of the project, which may be a good lead in for you, Aaron, I don't know, but thank you very much to Carrie, you and your team. Thank you for being here today, for staying with us through the process, getting to this point, and just want you to know how much we look forward to working with you. By the way, Steve Kellenberger, thank you for everything you supplied. We wouldn't be able to have proposed the plan for requesting these kinds of proposals without Steve's expertise and Aaron's. So one portion of this builds on the next. Thanks very much to all of you. So with that, Aaron, I hope that was a good lead in.
That was perfect.
Time to you to update us where you are with your work and RCLCO team.
Yes, thanks, Representative Snow, and that's really a perfect lead in, to our topics of conversation today, which we'll maybe go a little bit quickly through, in the essence of time, but just to say, as we get started, I'm really excited to advance our work working with the SOM team going forward, and you'll hear me mention several times, in our conversation today that there are places where we need additional input from the plan, or we need more clarity from the planning process in order to fine-tune components of how the organization will interact with developers, and what will the business plan really be. And so this planning process is going to be really critical, not just for us to understand how the site will physically lay out and to gain public input and guidance, but to drive the economics and the way that we're going to interact with potential partners. So let me pull up my screen for you all. I think there's really two topics for today that I'd love to get into with you. And we'll pause in the middle of this for some discussion and questions, since they're related, but they're not completely coincident. The first topic I think we're going to focus on today is diving into a deeper understanding of how the Land Authority will be organized and what that role within the broader development framework will look like. And then the second topic is really around, based on that discussion, how do we think about the economics of this project and understanding, how we generate a return on investment and how we can use a financial modeling tool going forward, like the one that we have set up to evaluate some of the planning scenarios, as well as some of the ideas that we're proposing, like, what if we had more open space, or, what if we had a really great innovation catalyst, or what if we have something that's part of the plan that we haven't even thought of yet. And so just to refresh our memories, back in September and October, while we've talked about several different topics in pieces with this group, the impact of innovation districts on economic development, other public-private developments of similar scale to the site. We've talked about trade-offs and market analysis. One of those conversations that we need to deepen is what the Land Authority's role in future development will be. And we've heard you very clearly that Pumsla should not be a real estate developer. You all want to find capable and quality partners to execute. You want to capture value over time. And you really only want to take the lead when your activity can create greater impact than the private sector can. And so we talked about two different ideas of how you all might play that role as a land steward. And what we're going to show today really dives into further detail on what we've called the proactive approach, which means that Land Authority will be set up to really drive ongoing strategic decisions, and be a little bit more of an activist in executing the vision and the program, not a developer, but a true coordinator and a true driver of outcomes on the site, as opposed to a more conservative approach in which you find a partner who really is in charge of making sure those things happen, and you're in more of a enforcement role, right? You make sure that they're performing, as opposed to taking those opportunities yourself. Just to share a few examples in more detail, we've talked about other analogous developments, of which there are many, but few that are exactly like the situation in which you all find yourselves. One is Stapleton, which is much larger at 4,700 acres. This is outside of Denver, it's a former airport. And very broadly, they established a development corporation to find partners and maintain and lease the land. That group prepared a master plan similar to what you all are doing and formed a public advisory board. And they created a clear master plan called the Green Book to guide development. And that also included understanding the costs and the needs for infrastructure and parks and sustainability metrics similar to what SOM shared. And that led to a contract with Forest City, which is now Brookfield, to execute that plan. And so rather than finding different residential developers or different office developers, or having somebody just do the infrastructure and then find partners, Forest City was largely in charge of the entire project. And they had an agreement about how quickly they needed to move through the site. They needed to take down about 1,000 acres every 5 years. And so in that case, they built the infrastructure and they built a few of the buildings, but they largely sold the land to other people after they had prepared it for development. And that's produced a very well recognized and thoughtful development, but it probably hasn't captured as much of the value upside for DIA and for the city as it could have, because it set a price on the land going forward, right? So there wasn't a negotiation every single time. Forest City captured the long-term upside of created financially from the development of the site. And that may have been necessary here because of how large the site is, but is not necessarily something that you all have as such a significant constraint because the site is only 600 acres. When we zoom into a smaller scale site, this is the Philadelphia Navy Yard, just 1,100 acres. It's a similar story. It's a former naval yard that was decommissioned in the mid-90s. There's actually still a shipyard on that left portion of the site today. The ownership was transferred to the city, and the city put a group called PIDC, which is a local economic development entity, in charge of executing the project. And they went through a process similar to what we're talking about. They established some districts. They thought about the infrastructure that would be needed to realize those different development parcels. And they sought different partners for each district. And this is actually quite similar to the model that we're proposing for the Point, in which PIDC found Liberty Property Trust as its first master developer for the Central Green District, which is that dark blue. And they sold the land to Liberty parcel by parcel once the sites were ready to be built on. And they shared a lot of business development and marketing responsibilities. And there was a sharing of infrastructure costs. They got the infrastructure to those larger colored areas that you see on the map. But Liberty was really responsible for making sure the infrastructure actually got to all the different buildings and all of the different development sites. And they're in the process of negotiating their second master development agreement with a group called Ensemble and a broader team of developers to take the historic core. And in addition, there were a few other individual partners. This is Urban Outfitters, they're the retailer's headquarters location. And so that wasn't necessarily part of one of these other master development agreements. And I think that's analogous to how we've considered the opportunities at the point in which there may be particular corporations or particular economic development opportunities or universities or other catalysts that may be part of a district, but may or may not be part of a development agreement. And so at a smaller scale, they actually get a little easier to understand, right? This is Novus Innovation Corridor outside of ASU in Arizona. And, the Board of Regents owns the land. ASU, the school, has a control over the land. Really, they wanted to develop an innovation district with the goal of raising revenue for their athletic facilities. You can see the football facility on the left side of the map. And they selected Catellus as their master developer. And Catellus has a lot of responsibility here. But they also, as long as they're performing, have almost a guaranteed return. And so this would be a model for the point, but it's not a model that we think we need to pursue because some of the major infrastructure projects within the point are regionally significant projects that already have funding goals and funding timing associated with them. One of those being Port Rockwell coming through the site. So in this case, Catellus, the ASU needed Catellus to install infrastructure and plan the site and entitle it and go find partners to take each of these individual colored boxes that you see as these blocks. And kind of an interesting transaction structure to make sure that they got the value of the site up front. So it's actually a land lease, but it's a single upfront payment rather than an annual payment. And that returns money to Catellus to cover the infrastructure with a return, and then the remainder goes to ASU. And so there's a couple of other interesting components of this, but this would be a model. This would be a more conservative model instead of a more proactive model to employ at the point. And I shared this Walter Reed case study partly because I think it has an interesting transaction strategy, and also because I think that this scale of site begins to speak to some of the smaller pieces that we might create within the point, where there would be a master developer in charge of a component, not just a block, but a really significant component of the site. And they wouldn't need to be 110 acres like this site is, but in this case, this is another former military hospital. The Army owned the site and worked with the city to create a master plan. They identified two tenants, Children's National Hospital and the Foreign Mission Center, which is a code in DC for embassies, to be other key tenants. And those are the light shaded areas that aren't part of this plan. And they negotiated a ground lease with a consortium of 3 groups led by Hines to create the additional internal site infrastructure and advance the development strategy. So they actually have a ground lease with the Air Force for that entire site in red. And when parcels are ready for development, they actually can sell them to a future vertical developer, or to themselves. And the land has a 100-year reversion clause. And so it's actually a way that they're maintaining land control while still making the transaction a little bit more straightforward, which makes it easier to finance. And so DC, which is really managing and coordinating between all of these different groups on site and ensuring the infrastructure is built according to plan, is receiving a portion of that land sale, every time one of these individual parcels is sold, to cover that cost, the management and the coordination cost. And then the remaining land value is returned to the master developer as a return on their infrastructure investment. And if you ask Hines, they would say they're hoping they break even on the infrastructure, and they really are hoping they'll make money on the vertical. But in order to finance the scale of a site, they really needed the ability to potentially transact with other parties who might also build buildings on site. And so we've described a few different ways of thinking about these different groups: a landowner, a land developer, a builder, which is somebody building the vertical buildings, and the eventual occupants. And we've modified that slightly from what we've shared before to better reflect what I think is the nuance of how some of these public-private developments are working, right? In which there's really a landowner, a public steward, which is responsive to the landowner, but is not necessarily the same group, and has more responsibility for on-site development and coordination and planning. And sometimes, as we shared with the Philadelphia example, also takes on some very high-level infrastructure development. There's a land developer, which is responsible both for major infrastructure and for physically preparing, individual sites for development. And those are sometimes one person and sometimes 2 people. And then there's people who actually build the buildings. And so, I think that as we start to articulate these different roles, it's helpful to actually compare what we're proposing for the point to these other communities that we've discussed, right? In each case, there's a clear landowner. There's at least one group in the public steward role. In some cases, there's actually more than one. And there's a lot of blurring of lines between major infrastructure developer, which you can think of as, really large roads. You'll hear called backbone infrastructure sometimes, because you actually, if you think about our site, you've really actually got to get a road and a sewer line and some power, some other utilities through the middle of the site to open up a lot of that land for development. And then there's the groups that are responsible with a lot of the pretty things that you actually interact with on the site, right? The smaller roads, where is the parking, how nice are the trees, where do the sidewalks go? And that's really the responsibility of the land developer, when you're thinking about it on an individual parcel. And there may or may not be other groups that are joining that land developer to build buildings. In most cases, there are. And so for the point, we're proposing a structure in which the land authority takes just a little bit of this major infrastructure developer role, because some of the major projects like Porter Rockwell and like the transit are regionally significant projects, and then finds multiple teams of developers similar to the Philadelphia Navy Yard and similar to Walter Reed that might take different pieces of the site, not a block, but it could be a block, it could be a 3 to 5 or a 5 to 7 year project, and that those site leads all really report up to the land authority. And so this allows us to get a lot of different people involved, to create some competition, which I've heard is something that you all really value and something that we think is good for the long-term outcomes on the site. And also to create opportunities for smaller players who really can't do their own land development to also interact and transact and be part of what we think will be a really great, potential outcome. And you don't necessarily need to do, break up the entire site and do it at once. We might identify 2 or 3 areas at the very beginning as part of the plan that we think could have distinct market opportunities, at the beginning of the development period, and look for entities to start on those. Or we may find a great anchor tenant or a great, university consortium, and that's almost their own, their own site lead, right? They would be their own team potentially, or they could be part of a broader development. And that's something that we'll need to work out through the planning process. So this is breaking down a little bit more these components of infrastructure, but I think there's, because there are so many different pieces of infrastructure and scales of infrastructure, that's partly why we're proposing that, there's a little bit different role available for the land authority, as opposed to, going out and hiring a, master developer like Catellus to build all of the major infrastructure for you. In that scenario, you're really going to incentivize Catellus to try to move through the site quickly, because they want to get paid back for the money they're spending on things like really large roads, or infrastructure around transit stations. And so by breaking the site into these smaller pieces and having the land authority play a greater coordination role between those pieces, you actually, make it a little bit easier for other groups to get involved and to get to realize a return, and to leverage the regional investment that's probably already going to be made into certain projects. And so that looks, just to blow this up a little bit, it looks a little bit like this, right? Where these multiple teams of developers are going to take a percentage of this land value, and pay it back to the organization to cover costs, with a majority of the land value either going to the state or going to regionally significant projects like a really, really great park that we want to have on site, that may not be something that a developer would build on their own, but that we think is important for the community. It could also go to certain catalytic users if there's a particular group that we think is going to really drive the economy and have benefits for everybody in Utah. We might be looking at using some of that land value to improve our ability to capture that tenant at the site. And so we've shared a few times in the past this idea of, so what does the organization need to look like in order to play that coordination role? And one of the things that we've realized looking at other groups is that, this is really going to be a team that needs to be highly skilled in coordination. And that has sufficient real estate and planning expertise to resolve, conflicts and challenges between, different partners on site to make sure that everybody's kind of working from the same book going forward. And, that's going to mean that you need, a fairly experienced, head of real estate or director of development, director of planning, could really be any of those potential titles. But it also means that, it would be nice to have additional expertise that has, years and decades of experience with this type of development, but that doesn't really need to be employed full-time by the Pointed Mountain Land Authority. And so to supplement the internal staff that's really going to be about working with the partners on a day-to-day basis and ensuring the success of the details, we've proposed a structure where there's also an investment or an executive committee. A handful of those members might be paid a stipend similar to how a nonprofit board member has a small stipend when they're really involved in the organization, and that group would really be tasked with helping make decisions, helping frame decisions for the board, helping them think through the pros and cons of different options, and providing that additional level of expertise to the internal real estate team, which you could build up over time depending on how quickly development began. And for this to work, right, there's a question of how you ramp up in terms of team, and then how long you need to sustain that team. But our goal is to self-fund the internal Pointed Mountain team, probably in about a 5-year time frame. And that the revenue necessary to support this team is equivalent to only about 1 or 2 acres of land a year. And there also are options where, depending on how you structure the transaction with the developer, you may actually be able to be cost neutral sooner. If you're taking essentially what would be a development or a management fee earlier on in those transactions before you really get to the land value. And so I think there's, while these numbers may look like a big cost, in the scheme of the overall scale of the development, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think they're necessary, and I think they're fairly comparable in relationship to income to what you see for Sitla and other sites that are trying to pursue similar structures. And so critically, I think the next steps for the organization for this process are to start to pull all these different pieces together, right? We've got the framework planning process that's going on over the next couple of quarters. One of the most important things for us to do as part of that, or parallel to that, is to get some developer input on the plan, but also on the transaction structure and on what we propose as the organization's role. And we think that will be invaluable to producing a plan that we know we can execute, and to having groups that have a lot of experience with this share little nuggets of information with us. And we can do that through a very public process. So we're proposing doing what we've called a request for expression of interest, which would be very non-binding, to offer groups the opportunity to give some input to us. And obviously we'd have to keep the specific input from each group confidential, but we could share in broad brush what we learned with the public and what's maybe driving tweaks to our proposal or changes to the plan. That would not be the qualification process for developers. So you could still potentially participate as a development partner on the site, even if you didn't want to join that informational process. And so towards the end of that framework planning process in Q2, we're proposing that you could begin this RFQ process for development partners. And that likely would include some of the ones we talked to, but we would just have a lot more clarity at that point on exactly what do we think some of the early phases of development are, and what are the characteristics and the risk profile and type of partner that we're looking for. And so really that RFQ is probably a Q3 endeavor. And at the same time, we would want to be forming the investment committee component of Pamsla that I discussed, so that that group could begin to provide input into the RFQ and RFP process. And going forward, we may be able to move faster through this RFP process depending on what we're looking for and what we find in the RFQ. But Q3 into Q4 would be moving from this RFQ to a narrower RFP that would be provided to a handful of the groups that were qualified through the RFQ process. And our goal would be for those development partners that we select to lead the next phases of planning for the particular sites that they're focused on. And that would probably be about the right time to consider hiring a director of development. We actually think the investment committee can provide sufficient input and maybe even better input early on in this development selection process. But as soon as you start to have multiple plans happening and different partners working on different things, that's when you really need the additional development expertise on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to just pause for a second and take questions, thoughts, or comments on this question of the land authority's role and this potential process going forward.
So Aaron, I guess I've got a question if nobody else does. So is it all right if I go? Does anybody else? Yeah, so in the 1st of July 2022, we should have all of the inmates moved to the new prison, and we will be facing decommissioning of the existing facilities there, surplusing things that are left and so forth, and vacant properties. I guess my concern is that, right now I've got my team working on pulling together reports for hazardous and abatement and that, and doing an overall study. So we're getting ahead of that a little bit. But as far as unfortunately, we don't have blank land here, right? We have buildings and facilities on it that we have to do something with, probably before it develops. And have you looked at that on whose responsibility that would be and where that would fall? Hopefully it falls in the second quarter of 2022. And I'm thinking that that's probably Pamsla's responsibility. It would be in their wheelhouse, in which case we would need to be preparing to request funding for that demo and so forth in the next legislative session. So I'm just wondering if you've looked at that and the timing and the responsibility.
Yes. So, it'll probably depend on exactly, what that list of needs are. But in terms of broadly the process of demolition and any abatement that would have to happen on site, we've accounted for the fact that really can't happen until the second half of 2022. And, that likely falls within what we've called the kind of that major infrastructure bucket, preparing the site for development. And so that would most likely be the land authority's cost to bear, unless there's an interesting proposal from a developer to do it differently. And I think that the timing we've outlined here dovetails really nicely with when the prisoners will be moved, because for the most part, a development partner is going to spend, at least a year or two of upfront, pre-development time, really having a solid plan, having all of their financing in place, understanding exactly what they're going to build and when, or at least the first phases of that. And, so having a couple of quarters of advanced planning time for them before the prison moves, so that the major infrastructure can start on site at that point, I think will actually give us a really nice overlap where we aren't doing one thing at a time. We can actually do a couple different things at a time. And that'll speed up the timeline for starting to build new development on site.
Okay, thank you.
So let me just say, Jim, that's really an important point, though, because not just with respect to demolition, but beginning at the end of this year, I think we will need to have some details about what's going to be needed in 22, and actually the first part of 23 in terms of appropriation requests. And I think that goes to that issue, Jim, because we're going to have to make that request in the 2022 session.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well. And I would just throw out there, as far as the abatement goes, we typically, because it's state property, we typically do all of the abatement and don't kick that to a developer because we have liability for the materials even once they're removed. So we would probably at least want to handle that portion of it and the decommissioning, and there'll be some costs associated with that. And if the demo is kicked down the road, then there could be some making safe and measures that we need to put in place because of leaving buildings there and liable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think as we get further along in the framework plan, we'll have a better sense of which areas we think are the early development locations on the site. Whether some of those historic portions of the structure might be desired to remain and be renovated or rehabbed. And I think that will give us a lot of direction on the questions that you're asking, so that we can put clearer numbers and timelines on those items.
Any other questions for Aaron?
I would like to, this is Steve, I just make a quick comment, and that is that Aaron and I have talked about this at length and just wanted to, there probably is some variations on this that relate to the schedule. That for instance, the RFQ process as shown here, doesn't really initiate until the framework plan is completed. And then we have about 6 months of going through an RFQ and RFP process before the planning reinitiates. So there's probably some opportunity for that RFQ process to slide to the left a little bit and be somewhat concurrent, with the framework plan, if we wanted to, move things along a little bit faster and be a little bit more concurrent and not quite so linear.
Yep.
If there's a desire for that.
Thank you. Other questions for Aaron? Well, Aaron, we'll just have you move forward then, I guess.
Sure. I will jump forward. So last meeting, we introduced the idea of the business plan and what would be included and how we were thinking about different pieces. And so we just talked a lot about this blue bubble, the organizational structure and role, and a little bit about the transaction approach. And I think the most important part on the transaction today is that we're really maintaining optionality. There are a lot of different ways, including many of the ones I outlined in the case study examples, that we could partner, or sell or lease, or some combination of the above, our land with a potential development partner to realize its value. And at this point, we think of both of those together as kind of the entity level or the enterprise level model. We're really accounting for the questions of the role. And I think we're leaving open questions on transaction, which we can continue to explore as we start to talk to developers and other potential partners. And also, to show you at a conceptual level what a lease versus a sale or a partnership, or some of these upfront payment models would look like relative to the value. But eventually it all comes down to the question of what is the project level cash flow? How much infrastructure is there? What is the cost to execute the master plan? And what are the market economics that are going to drive land value and absorption timeline, and the mix of uses on the site? And so today we're really going to focus on this question of the project level cash flow and talk about how these other pieces, including the scenario testing of other land uses that might be driven by community or state goals, intersect with those market economics and the project cash flow. And so, without reading you through this flow chart, the idea is that the first piece of the project is informed by the question of the market. What's the demand for different options and different land uses? How quickly could we absorb land on different product types, and how much revenue would be generated by selling or leasing land for those different product types. And that gets you to that top line revenue number. And so to inform that, over the past few months, the RCLCO team has been working through a detailed market analysis to forecast demand and pricing for the site, and taking a 30-year outlook through 2050 for the region and the site. So that involves thinking about demographics and population and economic growth and other pipeline sites and pricing dynamics today, incorporating lessons from other innovation and mixed use districts, and really focusing on the unique attributes of the site that will allow it to unlock some latent growth potential. And we went through a process for each land use similar to what we've shown on the right, where we think about the projections, how many people or how many new jobs, what's the character of that growth, how much space or what types of homes does that growth require, and what does that mean in terms of total demand in the region. And then we've taken that demand in the region and thought about where it's likely to go, both based on past trends and how we see those trends changing going forward, based on pricing dynamics and land availability and desired locations, and how locations are going to improve and grow and change. And so we've cut from the region to a sub-market level view, really focused on just the point of the mountain area broadly. And then, we've thought through 3 different scenarios, which I'll explain in a second, to think about what capture of that demand is, happens at the point. And so, there's a variance, between different scenarios in terms of what land uses and how much of the overall market activity we might realize. And so we've translated, a look at pricing potential and annual absorption, so a pace of demand, into 3 different potential scenarios. The first one is not a scenario that we think that you all should plan on, but there's an important scenario to understand because this baseline scenario is what we think the market would do with no guidance. You just said, we've got some land, would you like to buy it? That potential purchaser is not going to be particularly patient because they've paid you for the land and they need to make that money back. And there's also a lot of infrastructure necessary to get the eventual value out of the land. So we think that with little guidance, you're going to end up with development that feels and looks, similar to some of the things happening around the site, including the office development in Traverse Mountain. There's a different scenario, the one that you're currently pursuing, in which there's really successful public stewardship. And we think that all 3 of these are market-driven scenarios, including the one in which public stewardship really unlocks some market opportunities that the market by itself with no guidance wouldn't pursue. And that in this, what we've called this baseline plus scenario, we're really reflecting the idea that you all are a patient landowner, that patience enables mixed use, and that over time it enables higher densities. And that's unique for this site compared to other sites in the region, because the scale will really enable you to realize the long-term benefits. A lot of times in development, if somebody only has 5 acres, there might be something that you could do on that land that would be really meaningful to change the market for the land around you. But because you personally don't capture that benefit, people build the thing that makes them the best return now. And so, in this baseline plus scenario, which we think is really the minimum, that we should be planning for at the site, based on the clear guidance and dedication I've witnessed from this group. This is the scenario in which we really create our market for higher density and for mixed use. And it's not through public subsidy, it's through leveraging the patience and the long-term planning that we're doing right now. And so a true upside scenario, I think is the one in which we realize the benefits of an innovation district and the economic catalyst that we hope we can achieve at the site and for the broader state. So that's a thoughtful long-term vision, including, really finding some of those key anchors that will create this ecosystem for innovation. And, there's a lot of different variations on how that upside might play out. We've tried to model for you going forward, one that we think is has market potential, but really does demonstrate what the upside looks like. And so to better understand those in the context of the site, what that really means is, an upside scenario has much higher density development, 6.5 million square feet of commercial and 5,000 housing units. As compared to the baseline, which is really a little shy of 2 million and 3,000 housing units. And it generates more private investment at the site and less for sale residential, which will allow you to maintain control of the land. We've talked a little bit about how you generate land value, so I'm not going to necessarily go back into that, but we have modeled out the question of how much land value do these uses generate. And today, and through the conversations we've had with Steve and some of the input we've shared with SOM, one of the challenges for us that we can address through planning is how we move the market from valuing slightly lower density to slightly higher density, and thinking about over time how different product types which have higher values, higher land values per acre become feasible because of the decisions we've made at the site. And just to give you a sense of what this means, the rationale for patient and methodical development, is this upside scenario, right? Or at least the baseline plus, in which, compared to what the market might just do, on its own, the finished land value, what a developer would pay you at the end of the day for a site they could build a building on, we think today is somewhere in the 700 to 800 million range. If you really were able to add some catalysts up front where you had that boost in phase one, that looks more like the upside, closer to $1 million. And then the question is, how do you build value over time? And while the values we're showing in phase 3 would be really, really high for Salt Lake today, they're not that high compared to competitive cities in which, other innovation hubs are located. And so while locally these are going to be very high prices, they're not actually high for somebody who's saying, should I be located in San Francisco or Salt Lake or Denver or Boston? And so this next piece, so if we get through the revenue question, right, we have a sense of how much we could sell the land for at the end of the day to a builder. The next question is really about infrastructure costs. And this is where we're going to spend the most time with SOM, probably going back and forth to think about how we model it and what we understand and what the projects are and how much they cost and when do we have to build them. Today, we're doing something like this screenshot out of our model, which is saying there's a rough cost per gross acre. We have an idea of how much we have to build up front, how much we can build as the project goes on, and how much costs escalate over time. What we're moving towards and what we need to move towards is, this is an example from another project where we have a really good idea of what the projects are, how much we think they cost in today's dollars, and the third characteristic would be what the timing of those projects is and who pays for them. And the most critical piece today, I think, if you take away one big thing from the question of the economics, there is a project here. There is a project that will produce significant and meaningful land value for the state. What we need to do going forward is refine our understanding of the cost picture and refine our understanding of the program and the time at which we build that program, so that we can make sure that we understand how these different pieces are going to work together. And so today we're estimating those major infrastructure costs, which would include demo and major roads and utilities through the site. And we don't know, right? There's good estimates locally, that it could be 100 to 150,000 an acre. There's lots of projects in which it's been more than that. And we've also estimated additional land development costs, which largely in the scenario we're proposing would be borne by the future developers. And that includes, additional master planning, all of the, roads and pulling utilities through the site, small parks and amenities as part of their projects. And that can be quite expensive. We're estimating that today at 500,000 a net acre, so per development site. And so, in the baseline scenario that the market does what it, would do with no guidance, there isn't a lot of value left over. And that, if you all had decided to pursue that scenario, there would be no reason for us to have this, this board meeting or this land authority in this organization, right? You could have put out a for sale sign and hoped that somebody would pay you, some amount of money for the land and moved on, right? Invested it somewhere else and hoped you got a return. But we believe that because the statute really drives you to think about broader community and economic gains, the goal needs to be to realize something in between the baseline plus and the upside scenario, which undiscounted, so not thinking about when the revenues are realized and when the costs are incurred, that's a land value somewhere between 100 million and 275 million when you take out some of these infrastructure costs. And these are numbers that we're going to refine as we move into these master planning scenarios, and that we can test different scenarios in. Just to give you a sense, so this model also has an annual cash flow element to it, right? We can actually say by year, how much, what's the revenue and what's the cost, and what's the actual cash flow, and what's the cumulative cash flow of each project over time. And so you can see in the upside, the annual numbers are bigger and they're more frequent, but they take a lot longer to be realized because you're moving the land more slowly. But the end value is actually much higher. And this is a concept I might save for another day. There's a question of how you think about the net present value, how you value time, and compare the value of something that happens in 20 years to the value of something that happens in 5 years. And we would recommend that as a public entity, with the goals in the statute that you have, that you really don't need to be valuing the land at anything higher than a 5% discount rate. That's discount rates are similar and reflect returns. And in fact, there's a really logical rationale for valuing it at a 0% or even a 3% discount rate. So we can come back to that question another time. But the key thing for you to understand is that a private developer would value the site at least a 10% discount rate, if not 15 or 20 or 25, to reflect the fact that they need to make a return on their upfront investment. And so therefore they're going to want to build things as quickly as they can. And so that actually reduces the land value that they might pay you upfront if you were transacting and said, just pay me the money now and take care of the site as you go. And so it's really the rationale for the organizational structure that we've discussed, and this ongoing level of coordination and involvement that will allow the state to realize higher revenues off of the site, because you all have a patience that the private sector doesn't. And that also translates into program. As you think about higher returns, you push the site towards more for sale residential. And we can use this model going forward to test different types of goals, right? If we held more of the site for parks, if we reduced parking needs, which would actually be the biggest cost savings for any development project, is if you can reduce your parking needs, or if we allocated more land, at no cost to additional anchor catalyst users. And so we can play with those variables in this model as we think about different plans, or as we have different proposals come to us by potential partners. And so, largely our conclusions today and the key takeaways that are informing the business plan for the site is that there really is a rationale for ongoing public stewardship. Partly because, at most a developer might pay you $15 million for the site up front, once it's zoned and entitled, and that whatever they would build would not be in line with the community's goals or with the state statute goals for the site. With the land authority as a public steward, and playing that slight master infrastructure developer role, you begin to generate much more significant value, which could be, as high as 300 million if you think about it, without valuing the time of when those returns happen. And that's before that's before you account for the economic impacts in terms of the tax value or the jobs or the additional income and spending that's happening in the broader economy and on the site. And it increases your control, I think, while still managing the risk to an acceptable level. And so with that, I think there's more that we can obviously pick up on, and I'd love the opportunity to dig into this with anybody individually who'd like to ask questions or have a time to discuss this one-on-one. But I'll turn the floor back to Representative Snow to see if there's any thoughts or questions.
Thank you, Erin. A lot of really good information there and material. And as I mentioned, it dovetails really well now as we start to move forward on the plan. So to the board, I know that we're over time. Thanks for being patient. This is really important material. I'd like to give, if you'll just hang and bear with us, I'd like to give just a few minutes to Alan and then adjourn. And I've got a couple of things to say very quickly before we adjourn. But Alan, you want to touch briefly on some of your director's issues or items?
Well, let me compress this and just do two things. One, as we're heading into the legislative session, I want you to be aware of a couple of things we'll be involved in. One is a potential change in statute that in conjunction with MIDA and the Inland Port, we may be seeking to set up an infrastructure bank specific to the point of the mountain. That'd be a place where the legislature could appropriate and deposit funds for infrastructure in the future, and it would be managed by its own board, which would likely be a subset of this board, so that we could establish terms that would work to ensure that we can use those funds most appropriately. And then the second piece, we are seeking an appropriation this year, and I'm working with Senator Stevenson on the details of that and sponsorship. But we'd seek some of the pretty significant amount of one-time money that's available now to cover costs for the next 3+ years. And then the second thing, Aaron mentioned a time frame where we would start pretty quickly looking at a request for expressions of interest from developers, and then quickly thereafter looking at requests for qualifications. And I just want to see if there's any objection to our starting to put that process together. So number one, we don't get too far behind and keep the momentum going. But number two, so that we can get those developers in place through a formal process to provide input into our planning process, make sure that it's rooted in reality. So I just ask whether anybody's got objection to our starting to move in that direction.
I think this is a really long and deep discussion we probably don't have time for this afternoon. But, in principle, I think that's where we have to go, Alan, but I think that's going to require a deeper board discussion here in my thinking, Chairman Snow.
So I would just also add, it seems like Aaron presented some great information today, and whatever our path forward is, it seems like if we're not behind on making that decision, we're getting there fast. And I'm just curious, Representative Snow, the decision on which way this project goes from here, how it's developed, what the role Thompson and everybody plays. I'm sure that this board would input on that, but because it's going to be tied with significant funding on the state's part to make it successful, what will that process be like to ultimately determine how we move forward? It seems like, we need to go out with some of this other information, but it seems like that's a key piece that really needs to happen really fast.
Let me just comment on that, and anyone else can follow up with their own. I think it is we're at a critical juncture in making that decision. And Steve, you're right, we're out of time today. It deserves some attention, but I think we need to undertake that sooner than later. And Aaron and Director Matheson, I really think my preference would be that we come back at our next meeting and narrow this further to the concept, maybe some 2 or 3 very detailed concepts of what our role should be and moving forward, which will include then, or I think if we can decide that, then Alan, then we're ready for you to take the next step in terms of starting to explore those relationships. Does that make sense to anybody?
Yeah, it does. I just, is that going to be soon enough if we need any help from intent language or legislation this year to keep moving forward?
Well, Alan, I've looked at your proposed budget, and I think you have described the intents fairly broad. that way. My impression is that you're covered with the language. We can look at that. But I think the real question is, now that we have our planner and we've been so well educated by Aaron, is what does the model look for us going forward? And I think when we make that decision, I think it's going to be give Alan the direction he needs to actually begin exploring these opportunities. At least that's the way I see things. Steve, you had a comment.
No, I'm done. It's okay. I'm done.
So Alan, let me ask you, do you feel like our language in your appropriations request, we can broaden that to are you thinking, Jim, covering what? What do you think that we need to make sure that we include?
I think it would just be important for this next phase and the information we need to gather. What is our role going to be, and what's that? Who's going to, how is the infrastructure going to roll out? Because that really will make the big difference as I see it. Just the decision on what this board's, who's going to oversee it, who's going to be the land use authority, and how's it going to roll out? What part of the infrastructure is going to be put in place? And I mean, Aaron kind of showed how their best idea of how that could lay out, and seems pretty reasonable. But somebody needs to make that decision, and as we go out for RFIs or whatever information, it seems like those that we're going to present that information to are going to want to know some of that. Maybe they don't need that detail right now, but it seems like they would.
I think we need at least some concept of what our role is going to be and what this is going to look like. So I'm going to ask Aaron and Alan, are we rushing things to say we would put that on the agenda and actually narrow this to making that decision? Are we to a point where we can do that, or not yet?
I think that's something that we can do. Part of my concern is that last year we canceled our February meeting because we were in the middle of the legislative session, and it was hard to get a quorum and everyone's attention. And so I think we'll have to have some conversations about when we can meet next and put together materials to narrow the recommendation. But I think Aaron outlined today what their recommendation is. I wouldn't expect the board to just take it and say, we've got enough and we'll make a significant decision of that nature. You probably need to think about it a little bit, come up with whatever questions you have. And so I would expect it would want another time to go through this. I was just suggesting that at least for moving things along, we can start putting in place the infrastructure for doing an RFI or an RFQ. But I agree with Jim. We're probably going to want to know where this board wants to head before pulling the trigger on those things.
I don't want to belabor this, but I was just really trying to hone in on the fact that I'm not sure that the board here will be making that final decision because of the dollars assigned. It seems like we can make a recommendation, but it seems like maybe the legislature is going to have to make a decision on that. So that's the time element I'm concerned about, and I could be totally off, Mr. Chairman, but that's what I'm trying to get to. I think it almost seems like we need to make a recommendation pretty fast and let them act and make the decision.
Jim, my thought exactly. This is legislature and a governor decision ultimately.
It is, but I do think that that Jim is also correct that having our recommendation will help them make that decision, and holding that meeting to help decide so that we can make that recommendation, I think, is important. I think I interrupted someone, and I apologize.
That's okay. I was just going to add one thing, which is that the RFI is meant to help us gain information. And I know that's kind of inherent in the name of it, but while we do need to give some direction to those groups about what we're looking to learn and what we think the role for the organization is, what we gain from that process may produce variations. It won't take us from, we thought we were going to do model 1, now we're doing model 4, although it's possible we'll learn something that completely changes our mind. But they're going to be flavors, right? If we thought we were on 1B, maybe 1C actually looks, really interesting, or somebody gives us a variation that's really 1D that, we hadn't thought of, but that would work really well. And that probably lives within an organizational concept, either like the one we've outlined today, or like a different structure that, if you all aren't comfortable with the direction we're going, we should talk about alternatives. But I think as long as there is direction, there doesn't have to be a final decision to be able to talk to potential partners.
Probably a good point. In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest something. What if we break this down into a little smaller working group that can really drill down and help refine the process? Working with our director and with Aaron, and helping make a recommendation or some alternative recommendations to the board. That would be my recommendation, especially given the fact that we're into the legislative session or in shortly. I think it would help if we had a little more narrowing of these concepts. What do you think of that idea? And is that something you could support? Steve? Yes? Okay. So, Alan, is that something that we could put together as a little subgroup, work with you and Aaron and Steve, and then see if we can't narrow this a bit?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's a good idea.
Okay. So what I would recommend that you do is, if any of you would like to serve on that subgroup, if you would email Alan and myself, and we'll pull that together. And it's important enough, even though we're in the legislative session, I'll make time, Alan, that I can participate in that.
Great.
Okay. The last thing is, we've gone over time, and as I thought about this last year, we've gone over time a number of times. We allocated an hour and a half for this meeting. I can see us now getting into even more and more meaty discussions. I know that this is a volunteer committee, but our work is important, and I would like to propose, unless that we increase our meeting to 2 hours. And I know that's asking for an additional commitment from you, but is there anyone that would have serious objection to that, so that we have time to get through the material and the business of this meeting? Okay. Well, thank you. And saying thank you isn't enough. I know that. I don't know how else to tell you thank you, though. Your service is important to the entire state. So thanks for being here, members of the board. To the panel, thank you for being here. To our new planning partners, SOM, thank you for your presentation. With that, I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion.
Thank you, April. Motion to adjourn. Do I have a second? Steve is a second. All in favor of that motion, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.